we're going to start talking about now the notable influences on American political thought. And these are the philosophers behind American government, not just as the American government was formed by the founding fathers in the 1700s, but we're also going to talk about philosophers, thinkers, writers beyond the 1700s who are forming thought within the United States even today. And so there's a lot of philosophy in this here, and we've covered some of these folks already, so I'm just going to kind of mention them a little bit. But in discussing the history of the evolution of political theory, we've already covered a few of these folks, but we're going to get into a little more detail on some of these folks, and you're going to read some primary source documents on some of these if you haven't already. So the first real philosopher and thinker of the state, of a nation state or city state in a state of war, was Thucydides, and he wrote the Peloponnesian War. He lived about 460 to 400 BC, and he relates Pericles' funeral oration for a fallen Athenian soldier, and he describes Athens in the following way. He just says, "Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. That is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. And if man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition." So we are getting a description of Athenian government through this oration that begins to allow us to see how they described the democratic state way back in the 400 BCs. Our next philosopher we look at is Aristotle, who lived 384 to 322 BC, or thereabouts. He wrote Politics, and his basic thesis is that governments come in 6 types, with the former concerned with the good of the state and the latter concerned with individual interests. So we see here a push and pull of 3 different kinds of governments. You have a monarchy, who again is concerned with the the good of the individual versus the good of the state. Monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy versus oligarchy, polity versus democracy. And Aristotle says a citizen is one who has the right to participate in the administration of justice and the holding of office. Government should be of laws, not of men. And that's probably Aristotle's most famous saying. Again, a citizen is one who has a right to participate, but more importantly, government is of laws and not of men. The next philosopher we're going to look at is Machiavelli, who lived from 1469 to 1527. He wrote The Prince, and in it he said that, and again, a prince is just any old ruler. He calls him the prince, but it could be a duke, a bishop, or a king, or whatever. But he says, every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel. However, a prince must not mind incurring the charge of cruelty for the purpose of keeping his subjects united and peaceful. For with very few examples, he will be more merciful than those who, from excess of tenderness, allows disorders to rise, from whence spring bloodshed and plunder, for these, as a rule, injure the whole community, while the executions carried out by the prince injure only individuals. Machiavelli also says one ought to be both feared and loved as a ruler. But as it is difficult for the two to go together, it is much safer to be feared than loved, if one has to have one or the other. Machiavelli counsels rulers that they should make themselves feared in such a way that if he does not gain love, he at any rate avoids being hated. When the prince is obliged to take the life of another, let him do so where there is proper justification and a manifest reason for it. But finally, Machiavelli advises all rulers that, above all, rulers must avoid taking the property of others, for men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of their estate. The next influence on American thought, American political thought, are the thinkers of the Protestant Reformation, including Martin Luther, John Calvin, and John Knox. Martin Luther called for national control rather than Roman control of church finances. John Calvin argued that the church and the state ought to be structurally independent. Calvin accepted capitalism and encouraged trade and production. He also stressed thrift, industry, sobriety, and responsibility as a stimuli to industrialization and the establishment of the reign of God on earth. Calvin's influence can be seen in the writings of John Knox, the leaders of the Civil War period of England, the leader of the Civil War period of England, the Puritans in the American colonies, and in Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Montesquieu says of the English that they, quote, had progressed the farthest of all peoples of the world in three important things: in piety, in commerce, and in freedom. It is not possible that their commercial superiority and their adaptation to free political institutions are connected in some way with the record of piety which Montesquieu ascribes to them. Now, John Knox, in his Faithful Admonition, which is a pamphlet he wrote in 1554, urges the righteous overthrow of, quote, ungodly monarchs. Knox boldly asserts that it was the citizen's duty to correct and repress whatever a king does contrary to God's word, honor, and glory. Knox's struggle with the monarchy, specifically Mary Queen of Scots, eventually led to Presbyterianism becoming the official religion of Scotland. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan we've already sort of mentioned, so we're just going to mention it here briefly. As well as John Locke, Two Treatises on Governments. We've also discussed that. Baron de Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755, wrote On the Spirit of Laws. And Montesquieu may be the most cited of all the philosophers by the Founding Fathers. He advocated the separation of powers and really kind of laid out the philosophical basis for the structure of our own American government. He said, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. Again, there is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers. Sir William Blackstone wrote the Commentaries on the Laws of England, which an American edition was published in Philadelphia. It sold out its first printing in 1771, so all the Founding Fathers had a copy of Blackstone's on their shelves, and it established the legal foundation for colonial actions by defining the rights of Englishmen under the British Constitution. The primary object of law, as Blackstone said, is to maintain and regulate the absolute rights of individuals. Blackstone says the absolute rights are those such as would belong to a man in a state of nature. These natural rights include life, liberty, and which no human legislature may abridge or destroy unless the owner himself shall commit some act that amounts to forfeiture. So again, we're looking back on the state of nature, what we had during the state of nature as absolute. There are certain absolute rights that we did not give up for the sake of security, that we retain for ourselves And if those become threatened, that is life and liberty, then people have a moral right to overthrow the government. Adam Smith, who we mentioned before, wrote The Wealth of Nations. And he advocated a laissez-faire, or limited government involvement in the economy, based on individual self-interest, which would bring about a society in which everyone benefited. Smith argued that an individual, when driven by self-interest, promotes his own well-being, and if led by an invisible hand, also benefits society. Now, Smith did not argue for no role of government in the economy, in that Smith supported government enforcement of contracts, patents, copyrights, and the development of public works projects. In other words, there is a role for government in promoting economic development, according to Smith. But Smith advocates, he would not be somebody who would advocate for socialism or communism. Thomas Jefferson combined a lot of these philosophies into the Declaration of Independence, and you can actually point out where he's talking about certain, almost through the words of certain individuals, particularly Montesquieu. And we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence in detail, so I'm just mentioning it here. Also, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison's Federalist Papers should also be mentioned at this point too, although we'll look at those in much more depth, so I'm just going to mention them. John C. Calhoun, as we moved out of the Revolutionary era, had a philosophy of states' rights that is going to, ultimately rise up and bring us into this time of civil war. And but his philosophies are enduring within the United States and our federalist government. So they're worth noting that he says the Constitution of the United States is in fact a compact to which each state is a party. Now remember, when we say these we're quoting Calhoun, we're not saying this is necessarily true, or the way it turned out, or it's just part of the philosophy that we have in the United States, and parts of what he says would be true. Does it equal, the right to secede from the Union? Well, the Civil War proved that to be not true. But he says that the states have a right to judge of the infractions, and in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of power not delegated, they have the right to interpose for arresting the progress of evil. This right of interposition, be it called what it may, state right, veto, nullification, conceived to be the fundamental principle of our system. That a state, as a party to the constitutional compact, has the right to secede, acting in the same capacity in which it ratified the Constitution, cannot with any show of reason be denied. Well, that last statement turned to be not true, and had to be proved by the point of the Civil War. States do not have the right to secede from the Union. But this doesn't negate necessarily the idea that states retain certain rights, that we have this federalist system is underscored by Calhoun's writings. John S. Mill wrote On Liberty, and On Liberty sets forth the strongest argument for freedom of thought and expression and the development of individuality. Mill says the person, either through themselves or their government, have no right to silence expression. Quote, if all mankind minus one were one opinion, and only one person was of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be in silencing mankind. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. An individual is not accountable to society for his actions insofar as these concern the interests of no person but himself. For such actions that are prejudicial to the interests of others, the individual is accountable and may be subject either to social or legal punishment. So really Mills is talking about the limits of personal rights and freedom from government imposition on those rights. He goes very far in that and says basically, people have all rights except when their rights butt up against somebody else's, and that only when those rights kind of go up against society or individuals in the society does the government have any interest in being involved in individuals' lives.